you have a different song tonight? What's after this?
Karen, you're the last thing to today.
Okay.
So I think that people can stay in the bubble until 9 or 10 p.m. tonight. So there's no hurry to get out. So we can all just relax and chat and play music for as late as you can. Until the caretaker comes and speaks. Okay, so thank you all for coming along, and we're really delighted to have Dr. Karen Loomis with us in rather ethereal form to talk to us again this year, and on Harp Makers Day especially, to fit in with this whole instrument-themed session of the Scoil. And you can see her talk on the evolution of the Irish harp.
Where is she speaking from, Simon?
New Jersey.
Tell us, Karen,
Oh,
where are you speaking from out of the ether? Where are you speaking from is the question.
I'm really that Christian. I am speaking to you from my house in Titusville, New Jersey.
All right.
Just right on the Delaware River, very close to the point where General George Washington crossed the Delaware in Pennsylvania to New Jersey during the American War of Independence to fight the battles of Trenton and Princeton, which were a turning point in that conflict.
Very good. Anyway, without further ado, Karen.
Thank you all, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak to you today. I wish I was there in person. I hear it's a fantastic group of people there this year. Particularly delighted to hear about all of the harp builders that are here. The title of my talk is Evolution of the Irish Harp. First of all, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Is it too loud?
Yes.
No.
Okay.
I know sometimes it breaks up a little bit, so I apologize if there are points where, there's technical issues, but hopefully not. The title of my talk is The Evolution of the Irish Harp. And just for clarification, I'm referring to the metal-strung historical instruments of Ireland and Scotland as distinct from the later Celtic revival instruments. As I was preparing this talk, I realized that the title could just as easily have been The Evolution of Our Understanding of the Irish Harp. And by our, I don't just mean the people in this room, but the wider community in general. There's a tendency to think of the Irish harp as this one immutable object, the harp on the Irish passport, the harp on the coin, the Irish harp. But really, it was part of a living tradition. And like all living traditions, it adapted and changed during its time. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Now, some of what you're going to hear today are things that you are hearing or are going to hear from other tutors and other speakers at Scoil this week and possibly if you've been in previous years. But it doesn't hurt to hear from more than one angle. Just to give you a little perspective, for those of you who don't know me, I'm an organologist, which means I study musical instruments, specifically the early Irish harp. And my work is forensic in nature. I study the surviving historical instruments for clues to how they were made, and how they were used. And okay, so why is this kind of work important? Well, from the perspective of the musician, it gives you some context to better understand the music that you're playing on replicas of these harps, where it came from, what time period it came from, what was it like, what was the instrument really like, how was it played, things like that. And from the perspective of the builders, this kind of work gives you not only the context of when and where these instruments were made, time period, but also the details of the construction practices, the design philosophy, if you will, which then in turn makes it possible to strive to make reconstructions of the historical instruments that can more closely approach the original historical instruments, which in turn helps the musicians play instruments that are going to sound and behave more like those that were used in time period music. And if I can have the next slide, please. I just realized that if I press my button for the next slide, it doesn't magically make the slide change. Our technology is not quite that advanced.
Well, we needed some kind of arm to reach out.
So I wanted to start with this. This is a picture of the St. Maud reliquary. This is actually at the National Museum of Ireland, and if you are going on the field trip at the end of the week, yes. I'm sorry?
We're not seeing that on the field trip this year. We're skipping it.
Oh, never mind. Okay. I'm sucking my bird back in. If you go to the National Museum of Ireland, you can see this on display, unless it's off display for some special reason, but it's normally on permanent display. And it's very small little, it's almost the size of a small handbag. And it at one time contained the relics of Maud. It's originally from Cavan in the northern part of the Republic of Ireland. Although the focus of this talk is on the surviving instruments, I wanted to include this picture because it gives us a starting point on that timeline that I put on the bottom of the screen, which I hopefully you can see, and kind of gives us a sense of the scale and of how far back we're looking. The reason this is interesting is you can see there's a figure holding a harp that's probably King David, the biblical King David, with his identifying harp. This may be the earliest known depiction of an Irish harp. We don't know for certain it's an Irish harp, but it has elements that could identify it to be an early Irish harp. And so it gives us a sense of a starting point on our little time scale at the bottom. I highlighted, hopefully you can see on the screen, I highlighted the date of this reliquary, and I've also put in a little reference there that I just came across a really interesting, fairly recent paper that discusses the reliquary and the decorative work and the dating of that, and they place that right around 1100, plus or minus about 50 years. So it just gives us an idea. And to put that into a little bit more context, right around this time, back in 1188, is when Gerald of Wales wrote a brief description of playing of an instrument in Ireland. He calls that a kitara, which could be interpreted as harp, it could be interpreted as lyre, but I think the tendency is more towards interpreting it as harp. I think that's the opinion right now. So that also may be the earliest written description of someone playing an early Irish harp, and it's not that long after the date of this reliquary, so almost like in the same time frame. So it gives us an idea of how far back and the scale of the length of this tradition. We're really talking centuries. That also, it also speaks to how essential it is to understand that we're not talking about, as I said earlier, one immutable kind of harp. This is we're talking centuries here, and of course, things change. I remember when I first got interested in this instrument, there was still a sense of, it was just this, the Irish harp, and there was still at least in my mind, I know my own perceptions have developed over time, and just as a newbie starting out, I had to come to this realization that, yes, there's, the Trinity College harp, the Brian Gould harp, but that's not what was being played in the 18th century, when Edward Bunting was copying down the music that the last generation of harpers were playing, because it was, the instrument had evolved since then. So yes, it's a long time period, and I can even remember when I was starting my studies at the University of Edinburgh, where I did my PhD, and I can remember a conversation with one of the faculty members there, who I was showing him some photographs of the different surviving instruments, which span a fairly long period of time, and his remark was, these must have all been kind of ad hoc instruments because they're all different looking and they have different number of strings, so there must not have really been any kind of construction tradition, because he was lumping them all together as one group instead of looking at them as different instruments from different centuries. So of course they're different. So I'm hoping that if you come away from this talk today, one thing is that the understanding that, they're different because they're from different time periods, that things change, and there's context to think about. If I could have the next slide. Okay, so these two harp on the left is the Kilkenny harp. That's at the National Museum of Scotland. The harp on the right is the Brian Carew harp, and that's at the Trinity College in Dublin. And on the little timeline on the bottom, you can see that this big, long, smeary possible dates. And I've actually shown the absolute maximum of dates that I have heard people claim that these harps might be from. And if you look at it, it's like 400 years, it's 4 centuries. Now, to be sure, in reality, most people were saying, okay, 1300s, 1400s. That out of the ends of my little timeline scale there, there weren't very many people saying, this harp is from 1200 or this harp is from 1600. But some people were. And the point is that we really couldn't, without knowing the date of construction of these two harps, it was very difficult to say anything substantive about the context of the construction of these instruments and what kind of music was played on them, because we couldn't say with any certainty what century they were from. That makes a really big difference in understanding the instrument, especially since these two are arguably the two earliest surviving examples, it also makes it hard to understand the development of the instrument or the evolution of the instrument. You're kind of still fishing about to understand how old they are. So it's really important to pin down the dates of these, especially since there's such a big spread of possible dates. I mean, the 13th century is a completely different world from the 16th century in so many ways. And this has implications for how the music would be performed, what kind of music was performed in that time period in Ireland and Scotland, all sorts of contextual issues. If I could have the next slide, please. And just to give you a little bit of context of other information, because those two harps don't exist in a vacuum, this picture is from a grave slab in Scotland, on the west coast of Scotland at Keel's, the ruins of Keel's Chapel. So it's in Argyll. And for those of you that aren't familiar with grave slabs, imagine a stone sticking up, but just with a long slab on top of the grave, basically a coffin-sized slab. And that's what these are, and you see them throughout the West Highlands of Scotland from the late medieval era. And on this, there's a harp depicted that looks a lot like either the Queen Mary or the Brian Baruch harp in not only the shape, but the decoration that's been depicted on the garden is very strikingly like that. This is a very distinctive decoration. This grave slab is dated to the end of the 15th century. So one could argue, okay, then maybe that tells us that those two are from the end of the 15th century. But the tricky part of using comparative decorative work to date an homage is we don't know if the harp depicted on that grave slab is contemporary with the end of the 15th century. The example I like to give is McVitie's used to put out a biscuit tin with a horse and carriage on it. And I think I had one of these back in 2015. Now, that horse and carriage, imagine if you were an archaeologist from many centuries from now, you dug up one of these McVitie's biscuit tins from 2015, and you saw the horse and carriage depicted on it, and you said, oh, that means that people were using horse and carriage to deliver biscuits in the 21st century. Well, no, of course not. It was put on there as an emblem to give a sense of tradition. Oh, McVitie's, we've been in business for over a century. We used to deliver with horse and carriage a long time. So just because the style of harp is on this late 15th century carving, it doesn't mean that's necessarily a late 15th century style of harp. It could have been put on there as an emblem, and well, it was put on there as an emblem, but it could be an archaic style, because we do that today, and there's no reason why that wasn't done before. So you have to be a little careful with that sort of thing. But it's interesting to see that there. So that gives us sort of a later end of possible dates. Next slide, please. So this picture is really interesting and quite influential. This is a carving of an angel at Lincoln Cathedral in Lincolnshire, England. And you can see the date on there is pretty specific. It's actually known from church records when the angel choir was constructed and when it was consecrated. And construction began in 1256, and was consecrated in 1280. So we know reasonably specifically when this angel's care is holding a harp. We don't know if it's an Irish harp, but it does certainly look a lot like an Irish harp in terms of its shape. So it could be. It does tell us that there were harps of this sort and shape in the late 13th century, which is really very interesting. And in case anybody's wondering, it has, I counted the number of strings depicted, it has 17 strings. I showed this photograph to the National Museum of Scotland a few years ago, and they had labeled the Queen Mary harp as circa 15th century, likely mid-15th century, likely mid to late 15th century. And I had also, in my earlier work, found a cross on Iona that is dated to 1489 that has decorative work on it that closely matches some of the decorative work on the Queen Mary harp. So we were all saying, okay, maybe this is from the late 15th century based on the decorative work. But I showed this to the museum and I said, look, there were likely harps of this sort in as early as the late 13th century. We don't know how old the Queen Mary harp is, I said at the time. Maybe we should radiocarbon date it, because that's a even late 13th century, late 15th century, that's a pretty long stretch. And they said, you're right, let's radiocarbon date it. So if I can have the next slide, please. So we actually took samples from and dated each piece of the harp separately. That's the three main frame members, the neck, the four-pillar, and the sound box. They were sampled and dated separately. And the samples were calibrated, and then I adjusted the date for the position of the sample in the wood, and also taking into account the time between felling the tree and working the wood into a harp. So the date that you see there, which is sort of the second quarter of the 14th century to the first quarter of the 15th century. That's the likely date of construction of the harp, based on radiocarbon dating. The wood is actually a bit older. When you do radiocarbon dating, the sample that you take, the date that you get from that wood sample is the date of that tree ring where the wood sample was taken. So you then have to count tree rings to where you think the outer edge of the limb or the trunk or the piece of wood is to get the date of when that was felled, and then take into consideration how long the wood might have been sitting around before it was made into a harp. I don't want to dwell on this too long. I talked about this, last year, but if anybody has questions at the end, we can come back to this. The nice thing about this is we've collapsed down that long, smeary estimate of age down to 1 century. It's still kind of a broad window, but it's much, much better. And actually, I'm being very conservative. Part of the reason why this is such a broad window of possible dates is because I'm really being extremely conservative in terms of what I'm allowing for the dating from the analysis. In other words, we're quite confident that it's within that time frame. We could narrow it down even more, but we'd be a little bit less confident that it was in the time frame. But even this helps us considerably, because we can really point to this and say, yeah, this is almost certainly where it's from. It's not older, and it's almost certainly not numbered, considering the types of wood that were used. I don't think the wood sat around for like a century before they were used. This, for the first time now, we're able to say, okay, this is essentially a 14th century harp. Now we can think in terms of context of the 14th century. This harp is, we believe, from the West Highlands of Scotland, based on the decorative work, particularly on the four-pillar. We can say, okay, so what was going on there? We think that it might be, might have come from the some of the harp makers and crafts artisans in and around the Iona area. In a sort of a broad sense. One possibility, who could it have been for? This would have been an instrument likely for somebody of some status, based on the quality of the craftsmanship. At the time of this instrument, this is contemporaneous with John MacDonald, who was the first Lord of the Isles. He was his dates are 1336 to 1386, so it's right in that time frame. He was buried on Iona. So we can think about what was going on at the time period and think about the music, which is fantastic. And this is something we weren't able to really do easily before. It's one thing to say, oh, well, of course we think it's from the 15th century, or oh, of course we think it's from the 14th century. Well, not of course, until you can really pin it down with some analysis. If you were watching the screen, you might have noticed that the harp morphed into a CT scan briefly and then worked back while I was talking. And so what I also did with this harp, with the Lama harp, is in-depth analysis of the construction using CT scanning and other analytical techniques, which revealed to us for the first time the level of craftsmanship of these instruments. And if I can have the next slide, please. Thank you. So that picture that I showed you of the Queen Mary on the previous slide, it didn't really do justice to the artistic craftsmanship. So I thought I'd show you this picture. Sorry, the harp is lying on its side, but at least you can see it. Hopefully it shows up on the screen. This is a very high level of skill and a high degree of workmanship that went into making this. This is not some rude instrument that it was just banged out. And this speaks to the status of these instruments in the time period that we now know that this is from. These harps were used in for ceremonial playing, they were used to accompany formal praise poetry for aristocratic patrons, like the Lords of the Isles. So the instrument had a high status, and the harpers who played these instruments would have had very high status at this time period. So of course the instrument itself needs to reflect that in the craftsmanship that's in it. And we certainly see that reflected in the Queen Mary harp. The pigments that were used included vermilion, which is a very expensive pigment, would have been expensive at the time period. Also, although it's faded now, there are traces of pigmentation on the four-pillar decorative work that hint at a highly colorful, decorative pigmentation, much like illuminated manuscript. Imagine the decorative work on the four-pillar in full color. And that gives you a little bit of an idea of what that looked like. There's indications that there was more than one artisan working on this based on studies of the tool marks and the type of techniques used to create the decorative work. It speaks to the status of the instrument. And if I can have the next slide, please. And again, studying the instrument, we also see not only was there a high level of quality of artistic craftsmanship, but there was a high level of quality and sophistication of construction craftsmanship. And again, this is in keeping with the time period of the instrument and its use and its position in society. And we're able to see from taking the CT scans the sophistication of the design. Although it may look simple, and if you could go ahead and go to the next slide, slide 8, thanks. Although it looks simple, it's actually quite cleverly designed and quite elegantly designed from the standpoint of mechanical engineering. It's a fantastic design. It's quite sophisticated. That also indicates that this is likely the product of a mature and well-developed tradition of construction. It's very unlikely that this was made by someone who had never made a harp before and who didn't know anybody who'd ever made a harp before. So this was not a weekend project for, just ad hoc. This is part of a mature tradition of harp building based on the sophistication of the design. It's nice to have the next slide. Okay, so we're going to move on. And here are two other harps. The one on the left actually only survives as just the metal fittings to the neck of the instrument. That's the Ballandary harp, supposedly found in Cranach in Ballandary, although there's some questions about it wasn't really found there, but it's from Ireland. The wooden parts of the instrument are long gone. They weren't, found. They rotted away to Europe. So just the metal parts, and it's the metal cheek band and decorative end cap for a harp with 36 strings. Compare that to the Queen Mary and the Rheinblue harp. They were both originally constructed with 29 strings. So it's a bigger instrument. The harp on the right is the Loomis harp. That's at the National Museum of Scotland. And that's a harp with 31 strings. It does have 32 tuning pins, but it looks like it was originally strung with 31 strings. Note the spread and dates there. Neither of these has been analytically dated. I'm hoping to date the Loomis harp with carbon-14 dating at some point. And I do have approval from the National Museum of Scotland to do that. I put a little arrow there that says 1451. What's that about? Okay, so when I studied the Loomis harp, I found an inscription inside the sound box. And the inscription says simply AD 1451. Now, we don't know, unfortunately, if that inscription was put in there in 1451, or if somebody put it in later. And, we don't, so does that refer to when the harp was made, or did somebody in the 19th century just decide to put that in there and make it look old? I don't know. Actually having studied that, it looks like, based on the context inside the sound box and there's some repair work inside the sound box that overlays part of that inscription. The repair work dates to the early 17th century. The glue from the repair work overlays part of the inscription. So I think the inscription itself and very likely predates the early 17th century. So it might actually refer to the date of that harp. That's interesting because the history that is associated with this harp, which is unconfirmed, is that it was acquired by the Robertson family of Bude in Perthshire, Scotland, through the marriage of a lady of the Loomis family of Argyll, sometime around 1460. And actually later on, someone did some research in the 19th century, Bell writes in 1880, based on Burke's landed gentry, that woman was identified as Lilias Lamont, and who married into the Robertson family in 1464. So, tantalizingly, this could be a mid-15th century Irish harp and Robertson, Irish Scottish. Which is why it'd be really nice to check that with carbon-14 dating to see if it really is. Because unfortunately, we have this big spread. Yeah, it could be 15th century, but notice I put on the timeline all the way to the mid-17th century. Why did I do that? What makes us think that this could be from that late? Well, there's an inscription on the side of the harp that says, Al Stewart of Cluny, his harp, 1650 or 1656, depending on how you read the scratched-in inscription. It's done really casually. It's not a formal inscription. So it's like somebody took a biro and went to scratch it on. So some people have actually said, oh, well, that's how old the harp is, and the first owner scratched it on there. Well, not necessarily, but people said that. It would be nice to know the dates of these instruments with a little bit more certainty so that we could understand how they fit in with the evolution of the instrument as a whole. Are these 15th or 16th century harps? It could be. They're a little bit bigger than the earlier two that we looked at. They've got these straps, these support straps on the neck. Both of them have. Is that a suggestion that there's a little bit more tension on the frame, so it needs a little bit more support there? Maybe. They're all sorts of questions. If I could have the next slide, please. Okay, so we've moved on to the 17th century for real. And these three images, the first one on the left is a harp from Pretorius's book on musical instruments, and that was published in 1619. It looks a lot like the Lamont harp and the Boundary harp. Interestingly, in the descriptive part of this book, Pretorius describes what sounds like a harp that is chromatic. Now, what do I mean by chromatic? Up to this point, the harps we've been talking about have one row of strings that would have been tuned diatonically. In other words, like the white keys on a piano. They're not able to play. Oh, did you lose me?
No.
No, but I forgot to plug the power in.
Oh no, I was running around the car. You tell me if I'm rambling on too long. You need to cut me off. Or if it's boring and you say, Karen, it's boring. Stop talking. So up to this point, we've been talking about harps with a single row of strings, most likely tuned diatonically, which means without, just like the white keys on a piano, without accidentals, without the sharps and flats. And while for sure you could, if you needed to play a note that was out of that range, you could retune the harp beforehand, but you couldn't play a whole bunch of accidentals. But that's okay because the music up through, I would say, the early to mid 16th century, that's what the music was like. However, from the mid 16th century onward, music was swiftly moving on and was including notes that were what we would call chromatic, the accidental sharps and flats. And these earlier harps would not have been able to include those notes in performance easily. So what happened in the early 17th century? By the early 17th century, that was all rage. That was where music was at. So you had to adapt or fall by the wayside in some respects, particularly for music at court, where the latest and greatest was being played. So Pretorius describes, he calls it an Irish harp, and he describes the tuning of the strings. So he lists the tuning of the strings, although it's a little bit muddled, unfortunately, in his description, but it sounds like he's describing an Irish harp that included these chromatic notes. Other harps in the early 17th century, for example, the Arcadocia of Italy, and then also the Spanish harps. Siobhan knows more about this than I do. They had more than one row of strings, and there was, in particular, there was a row of strings in the center that would have been tuned to the equivalent of the black keys on a piano that would allow the musician to play these notes in performance. The middle picture is the cloying, and actually this picture is from Armstrong's book on the Irish harp, and it's a bit of a mock-up. Really, the only surviving parts of that harp are the neck and the four pillar. The sound box doesn't exist. So this is really a mock-up, just to show what it might have looked like when it was whole. The interesting thing about this harp is it has, in addition to the one row of tuning pins, a short second row just above that in the middle on the neck, suggesting that it might have been set up to, at least for part of its range, to play these chromatic notes. That harp dates to 1621, and that would have been right in keeping with the time period. Because there's a big question, what about whether or not the Irish harp in the early 17th century was an instrument that could play chromatic music like the Italian harps, like the Arcadocia. The picture on the right shows a broken consort. A broken consort means a small group of musicians playing different types of instruments, rather than all playing violas or something like that. So we've got viola da gamba, a lute, a flute, and an Irish harp. The guy playing the Irish harp has been identified as probably Darby Scott, who was employed at this time period in the court of Christian IV. Just for context, Christian IV was married to the sister of James I. He's James VI of Scotland, James I of England, which is kind of interesting. So I don't know if there's some connection with the harps that were being played in Scotland and Christian IV wanting to have an Irish harp playing at his court. But clearly, this consort is most likely playing art music for court, probably music of the time period that would have most likely included chromatic notes. So was Darby Scott playing a harp that could play chromatic notes, an Irish harp? I would say it's quite likely. So it's something to think about, though. Unfortunately, we don't have any intact Irish harps from this time period that we can point to and say, yep, there's one. So we have to sort of look at the information that we have and piece together the clues and piece together the musical clues. But it looks like it's highly likely that at this time period there were largish instruments. I mean, if you look at the size of Darby Scott there, that's in that harp, it's a pretty good sized instrument. Substantial instruments that could play chromatic music of courtly music of the time period. And yes, there was music that could have been played on an Irish harp. Examples of composers from this time period, Cormac MacDermot, who flourished from the late 16th century to the early 17th century. He was Irish, he played the Irish harp, and he was employed by Robert Cecil, who was the Secretary of State in England at that time. He was also part of Elizabeth's royal music at the beginning of the 17th century, in 1602 or 3. And after she passed away, he became the harper to James I. Interesting thing about him is that, well, first of all, he was a composer as well as a player, and some of his music survives, which is really great. And it is sophisticated courtly music. But the other interesting thing is, before he was hired as a court harper, the last English court harper was 50 years prior to him. And he had died in, let's see, I don't think I wrote down his name, but the one fireman had died in 1565. So a whole generation plus. What happened? Why was this began? What's that about? Well, what it might be about is the fact that the music that was being played in the latter half of the 16th century and into the 17th century, the art music had shifted towards the chromatic music, and the instrument needed to catch up. And it's possible the instrument didn't catch up until the beginning of the 17th century, and then at that point it was included. That's me speculating, but I think that's a plausible explanation. And also in this time period, in the late 16th century, there was a shift in musical culture from, at least in England, from formal epic songs to more courtly melodic music, the type that you might hear in the Windwasses harp consorts, for example. And we see that shift in Ireland and Scotland a little bit later on. I can have the next slide, please. I thought I would insert this in here. I want to go back to the law and art for just a brief minute. But I put this in here and with the 17th century because when I was researching law and art, we found a wire fragment and we analyzed it. And which is great because we were able to tell what kind. It's brass, by the way. And the thing about brass wire is not all brass wires are alike. Some has more copper, some has less copper. Brass is copper plus zinc, by the way. And the other interesting thing about this wire, and the reason I put this, you notice I put a date on there, sort of late 16th century to late 17th century. And again, this is where we kind of get some context in here, just by looking at this piece of wire. And this is something I talked about at a talk at Scoil a few years ago. This particular piece of wire has a defect in it. It's actually a big defect, and it probably was big enough that that's what broke this wire. And the defect is a big, long inclusion of that's mostly iron, and it caused a crack in the wire. It just wasn't a good piece of wire. Well, that actually tells the story. So in the British Isles, there was a push to develop a domestic brass industry to compete with the enormous brass industry in Dresden that was exporting brass all over Western Europe and had been since the medieval era. And there were some issues with this fledgling domestic brass industry. It was producing, it started in the late 16th century, actually mid-16th century, 1568, and it petered out around 1670 until it re-emerged in the 18th century in Bristol, and then it really became a juggernaut. But this first attempt at domestic brass in the British Isles was kind of a less than stellar. The brass wasn't good quality. They didn't realize it at the time, but they were using coal instead of wood for their heat source when they're melting the ore, and coal contained sulfur, and sulfur was being absorbed by the alloy and causing it to be brittle. So it wasn't good quality brass. So of course there was a black market, and people were smuggling brass in from abroad because it was better. But also people were then melting down brass objects and reusing them rather than using new poor quality brass. Add to this, during the English Civil War, in the mid 17th century, there was a shortage of brass all over the British Isles because it was all going to the war. So we had a shortage of brass, we had poor quality domestic brass, we had people trying to smuggle in brass from abroad, and that's of course trying to shut down, and lots of people melting down old candlesticks and whatever to get brass to use. And the problem with melting down stuff to make new things out of brass is you're going to end up with other stuff in there. And particularly if you melt down cast brass objects. Cast brass objects contain a higher percentage of lead than work brass, and it's because it makes it flow better into a mold. So you're going to end up with, if you're trying to make musical instrument wire, which is drawn out of brass that was meant for a cast object, you're going to end up with lead. You're also going to end up with other bits and pieces of things that don't belong in there, like pieces of iron and stuff like that. And that's very likely what happened here. It's really interesting. It's a little bit of a sidelight. The other interesting thing that I noticed with the construction of these harps, the earlier ones, like the Lomont and the Queen Mary and the Trinity, the Brian Grew, is the string holes, that is the holes where the wire passes through the sound box, are relatively large compared to the later instruments from the end of the 17th century and the 18th century. And it always made me wonder, why would you do that? Why would you make the holes so big? You don't want to make them bigger than they have to be, because that weakens the front of the sound box. It could crack there. And why then start making them small later on? And it might be actually tied to the brass quality, because the earlier instruments may have had strings wound around narrow metal toggles, as opposed to fat wooden toggles. But you've got, and those you would be able to easily poke through the hole in the front of the sound box instead of laboriously trying to fish it through a sound hole. But if your brass is really brittle, it's going to break if you try to wind it around something narrow. So you have to use something wider, like a wooden toggle, that is not going to cause it to break. But that you can't push through the hole in the front of the sound box. It's not going to, the string hole, it's not going to fit just that. So you have to fish it through a sound hole. In which case, you don't need to make a big string hole. You can make the string hole just a little bit bigger than the string, which is later harps are like that. So I just wanted to add that little sidelight because I thought it was interesting. It's slightly, what I'm saying is slightly speculative, but it just kind of gives us a clue to the forensic nature of this work and what it can potentially reveal in terms of context. And context not only of what the musicians went through, but also what the builders had to do and the changes that needed to be made. So if I could have the next slide, please. Okay, so now, so a lot happened in the 17th century. At the beginning of the century, we have possibly largish, chromatic, possibly Irish harps. Once we get to the late 17th century, though, the instrument has changed. What happened? Okay, so this is a picture of the Kildare harp. This is in storage at the National Museum of Ireland. It's customarily dated to the late 17th century, and it was possibly made for Robert Fitzgerald. I've included it here because I think it's almost a transitional instrument. It's what we would call, or what Joan Rimmer called, a high-headed harp. And Joan Rimmer in the 1960s was probably one of the most important articles about the Irish harp ever. And in it, she separates the instruments out from the low-headed and high-headed. By low-headed, we mean the neck of the harp sort of swoops straight forward or dips down a little bit. And as opposed to the high-headed harps where the neck of the harp actually scoops upward and it has a longer forepillar, basically. So it's a long forepillar, and the neck actually meets the side of the forepillar in these high-headed harps. It joins on the side, as opposed to the earlier harps like the Queen Mary, the Lamont, and the College harp. The neck of the forepillar is actually mortised into the top of the forepillar. So the change in construction is a change in proportions, it's a change in relative string lengths from bass to treble. So what happened? Why did it change? Lots of things happened in the 17th century, both musically and socially. There was, in Ireland, a loss of aristocratic patronage for the Irish harp players after the flight of the earls in the early part of the 17th century, in 1607, when basically all the aristocrats that they had to leave Ireland. So there goes your patronage abroad. Something similar happened a century or more later in Scotland after the Jacobite uprisings in 1715 and 1745, which I think were actually kind of the death knell for the harping tradition in Scotland. So here we have an instrument that was part and parcel with this world of very formal accompaniment to praise poetry, and also art music for aristocratic patrons, and suddenly the patronage is not there. And you've got this large instrument that is not something that you can easily lug around. It might be a very expensive instrument. Oftentimes the instrument would have been provided for the musician by the patron. So without that patronage, what do you need to do? Well, you need to then go from house to house in search of, instead of working for one patron, that's your boss, you live in the household, you've got your harp provided for you. You may have to have multiple patrons now, or multiple venues where you're playing. So you need an instrument that's going to be more portable. You're also going to be playing perhaps a different repertory of music. You have to play what your audience wants to hear. Are you going to be playing a lot of formal art music? Are you going to be playing a lot of airs and dance music that is not necessarily chromatic music? So I believe that a lot of this shift has to do with the venues that the harpers were playing, the amount of traveling that they needed to do, possibly with just one assistant, not with a whole entourage. So it's you and your assistant and a horse and a harp. Interestingly, once we get into the 18th century, generally, not just in the Irish harp world, but generally, the performance of music was shifting from aristocratic patronage, where you play for your one boss aristocrat that employed you, to a more entrepreneurial scheme where you were playing, where the musician was playing for an audience, for concerts. So this really harks back to the gradual rise of the audience. So it's a whole different world, a different scheme, whereas before it was the musician was playing for a patron and that patron's family and maybe that patron's guests, to a musician is now playing a concert for an audience. And the musician is traveling from venue to venue, from house to house, or from concert venue to concert venue. So it's a very different world, and so of course the instrument needs to be different to fit the need. So that's my feeling here. I don't know, it's speculative, but I suspect that had a lot to do with the change. And also, there's the music was changing as well, and there's a change in the sound. In the 17th century, late 17th century into the 18th century, we also are at the point where most of the harpers are no longer using their fingernails to strike the notes, they're using the finger pads and give you a different sound. And this is something that I think Simon could talk to you more about, because he's been doing some really interesting experimentation with replicas of some 18th century Irish harps and playing with the fingertips instead of the fingernails, and experimenting with the stringing and the type of sound that produces, and how the music from the time period sounds was played that way on that kind of an instrument. I can have the next slide, please.
Just to say that you're now over time, so if you could.
Okay, I'm nearly done. I've actually only got two or three slides left, and they're quickies. So thank you for the reminder.
That's okay.
I just wanted to show you these two examples of high-headed 18th century Irish harps. I picked these two because they have specific dates that attach to them. The one on the left is the downhill harp, and that's at the Guinness Storehouse Museum in Dublin. You can see it there on display. And it was made in, according to the inscription on it, it was made in 1702 by Cormac O'Kelly and played by Dennis O'Hansey. It's really important because some of Dennis O'Hansey's repertory survives and was written down by Edward Bunting. So we have the instrument and we have the music that was played on it. So it's always a good thing, good combination. The one on the right is the Bunworth harp. That one is in the United States. It's at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. It was made in 1734, according to the inscription, by John Kelly for the Reverend Charles Bunworth. And I will quickly go on to, I don't know, I have more of this. I'll skip what I was going to say there. Just let's go to the next slide. Okay, so there are a bunch of 5th century Irish harps. How many? I think there are, if you include the late 17th century all the way through the 18th century, I think there are 13. I hope if I missed one, Simon will mention it. All of these are there to be studied and are something that we can learn from. The music, as Simon has probably pointed out to you, or will, the music that survives, that has come down to us primarily from Bunting, is from the 18th century. And these are the instruments that play this music. So they're the ones that we want to study and find out how they were made, and look for clues to how they were played and how they were strung up, and to help us approach a better understanding of how to reconstruct and how to play that music. Simon, as I mentioned, is doing fantastic work. Barbara has been doing work laser scanning the Kildare, which I showed in one of the previous slides. Siobhan had the Loomis, which is another 18th century Irish harp laser scan. So work is progressing. The interesting thing is, at the beginning of this talk, I said that I had a conversation with this faculty member that sort of lumped all of the Irish harp together from the beginning to the end as sort of this one big amorphous group. And up until actually fairly recently, we've been kind of lumping the 18th century Irish harp all together as one big group. But now, thanks especially to the work of the people I just mentioned, we're starting to tease that apart and get a better and more nuanced understanding of these harps, and hopefully that will continue. If I can have the last slide, please. And we come to the end of the timeline, and a little segue for Nancy Girl. So the gentleman on the left is Patrick Byrne, and he lived from around 1797 and died in 1863. And he's seated play as what are called a society harp built by John Egan. John Egan was a Dublin harp maker of the early 19th century. And in the early 19th century, there were a couple of efforts to form schools to teach Irish harp, to help to keep the tradition going. The first Belfast Harp Society ran from 1807 to 1813, and that kind of closed due to lack of funds. There's another slightly more successful one, 1819 to 1839, and they commissioned John Egan to make harp for the students to learn on. Egan was trained in the French tradition of harp construction. That's a different kind of harp. But he adapted what he knew from that style of construction and put metal strings on it. And so really the society harp is a blending of different construction practices, a continental pedal harp construction with the metal string of the earlier Irish harp tradition. Because there was no one in Ireland wide that was still building early Irish harps, which is why they got John Egan in. The gentleman on the right, and I'm sorry I don't have his name, Siobhan, if she's around, might be able to tell me. We actually, she and I ran into his granddaughter a few years ago in Wales when we were giving a talk. And the granddaughter had brought this photograph in of her grandfather. He's holding a royal portable harp, also built by John Egan. And it's actually gut-strung. And it has a fourchette mechanism it's a sharping mechanism, so you can play accidentals, and it's operated with little ditals. There's a little hand-activated mechanism on the fourth pillar for sharpening the notes for changing the length of the string by semitone. And what Egan had done is he had combined elements of the shape of the harkening back to the shape of the early Irish harp, but he saw an avenue or for a different kind of a harp, for a different audience. And I mention him because this is, I think he laid the groundwork for what happens later on in the 19th century with the Celtic revival and this interest in all things Celtic in inverted commas, Celtic and ancient, which ended up with the development of the modern Celtic revival harps, the Neo-Irish harp. I'm going to end there, and hopefully we'll hear more from Nancy Thurl about John Egan and his harp. And I thank you very much. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask.
Okay, do we have questions? Nancy is looking most eager.
Oh, no, and please correct anything I said that was incorrect.
Oh, that's not what I was going to say, but I will just say it was called Royal Portable Irish Harp. And I noticed that modern historians, even some people have called it an RPH, but it was always Royal Portable Irish. That's really important to have the word Irish. And really the royal was just after he received the royal warrant. So the royal is kind of insignificant. The model is really portable Irish harp, which was important to Egan and important in the time period, post-colonial Ireland. It's really important to have that word Irish. But anyway, talk more about that later. What I want to know from you or Simon, the tradition of the blind harper. I'm wondering, you know, I've never heard this really discussed, only in connection with Carolyn and the later harpers and the revival, which was, you know, create schools for blind boys. I'm wondering if, when you say there was this real change in the late 17th century, do you think that maybe the harpers, it became more of a trade for blind people at that time? Or was there a tradition for the blind harpers even before that?
Karen?
That's a really good question, and I love your observation. There was a tradition before that. We think, for one thing, there is an early 17th century saying that goes, "Take that, you blind harpers," which is used when you like toss something or throw something. It's the extension of "take that, you blind harper," and it refers to the buskers who were blind and played harp, but also would have played hurdy-gurdy or fiddle or other street instruments. And so I do believe that at least as early as the early 17th century and possibly earlier, there was this tradition of blind musicians, and including blind harpers, because it would work because they were not sighted, and this was considered work that they could do.
Well, so take that, you blind harper.
But there were sighted harpers as well.
There were sighted harpers too. In fact,
It became a thing
later.
later.
What's
It became a
the
tradition
name
later.
of our man? Is it Frank Callery, who's doing research into the history of the blind and has done a lot of work on the harp societies? But I think a lot of that research is the 19th century, a little back into the 18th. So I don't know if anybody's done work.
Just in terms of historical, when you get back to when the harp had high status and was part of the society of the tribal chieftain and tribes, it was a family. Goes from father to son, father to son, whatever, and therefore not blind, probably not blind, but of course a lot of people became blind through disease, but it wouldn't have been a job for a blind person because it's
That's what I
wondered,
wondered, right.
And I think maybe when that society breaks down, and then you start getting, it starts becoming something that a blind person can do.
Carolyn.
Well, regarding that, it really reminds me of the equivalent of that being blind organists in continental Europe in the 15th century, such as Konrad Paumann. And it makes me wonder if it's just linked to the tactile aspect of those instruments, the organ and the harp. I mean, it's easier to play those instruments blind than, say, a fiddle or something like that, because you can orient yourself.
Well, I know there is a tradition in many cultures. There were even blind harpers in Egypt. There's iconography at the MFA on a stone slab, of a blind harper playing an Egyptian harp. And I know that there were Paraguayan blind harpers. But I'm just thinking, in the Irish tradition, it became a thing, but it wasn't necessarily a thing in early times, was it?
Not necessarily.
We all did in Ireland a poem called Misha Raftery and Philip. Anybody do that?
Oh yes,
Fearchan Ishmael is Mahul Labola. Behold me now, facing the wall, like Shinnon Kyo, the folky full of playing music to empty pockets. And Raftery was a fiddler.
It was known as blind raftery.
I think the answer to this one is, it's a great question and we've got fragments, but
So
somebody
we
needs
need
to
to work
go
on
through
it.
it.
Yeah, that would be.
Do we have any other questions about different aspects? More?
This fascinates just the point. Okay, you've got diatonic instruments in the medieval period, late medieval period. Then you have a little section where you're talking about perhaps instruments with sharps and flats, possibilities playing it, and then they're gone. So I find that interesting. Are these the chromatic instruments, are they for the foreign courts or the whatever? And is there still a tradition of diatonics that's going on all the time underneath it?
That's a really good point. I think so. I think that there were probably always the diatonic instruments, and that the chromatic ones would have been for court, for playing the kind of art music that was being played at court that required that sort of instrument. But I suspect that there were probably always the diatonic instruments. Because there are plenty of situations where you don't need that kind of a harp, and that those may have just continued on.
Can I just ask a very brief question and you can give a brief answer? Are you certain that the medieval harps were diatonic?
I don't know how they were tuned. So no, we do know that you couldn't retune them in performance easily, at least not the metal ones. So in other words, if you had a bunch of accidentals in the music, what we would today call accidentals, where in one measure you got a natural, and the next measure denotes a sharp.
No, what I mean is, are you certain that they have a 7-note octave?
No, I'm not certain of that.
Could they be tuned as a sort of with
You
9 notes
could
and an
tune them
octave?
in sort of, you could tune all sorts of ways. But that's a good point. But I think what they couldn't do though was effectively play accidentals in performance, because you can't easily change the tuning of an individual string, and if you need the equivalent of the sharp or the flat of that string, and you don't have it pre-tuned ahead of time, then you're stuck. But if you've got music where, for example, in the early 17th century, where in some measures you've got sharps or fourths or whatever, and they're not in other measures, unless you've got extra strings already tuned to those notes that you can then grab, then you're kind of stuck. Because you're not necessarily going to be able to pre-tune to play that kind of music. Whereas in the medieval era, sure, you could have tuned to different, there were all sorts of possibilities of different tunings that you could use, but that's a different story, that's a different type of situation to what we had in the early 17th century, where you had music where you had to be able to play all those notes, even within a single piece.
Okay.
Thank you. Could you define the term chromatic music?
Sorry, I didn't hear the question.
Can you define the term chromatic music?
Okay, so that's music that if you compare it to piano, it would include all the notes, not just the white keys on the piano, but also the black keys, so all the sharp flat, all the possible notes in an octave, including all the sharps and flats.
Right, thank you.
Do we have any other questions for Karen? I'm not going to turn you off instantly as soon as the session's finished. So if people want to continue a general conversation, that's fine as well.
Thank you for listening.
One second, we have one more question.
I had a question when you were talking about the music in Scotland. I think it's probably somewhat artificial to distinguish between Scotland and Ireland in this period. I mean, the language was the same, identical up until 1600 or something.
Yeah.
And there used to be intermarriages. I know that a boho princess in my own family went and married the Lord of the Isles. Can't give you chapter and verse for that. In Clanranald MacDonald, they were, and I don't even know enough to know whether that's the same MacDonald you're talking about. Have you any views on that?
I think I got the gist of the question. The sound was breaking up a little bit, but my understanding of your comment was that there really wasn't a distinction between Ireland and Scotland in terms of these instruments in this time period. And I agree with you.
I think he was making a point as well, more generally, that there wasn't much cultural influence.
cultural difference, yeah, quite, yes, quite. Yeah, there was a lot of back and forth, and there was a very close connection culturally. The languages did separate, I think, after the 14th century, but no, culturally they were very close. Once you get later on in time, there's a little bit more separation. There are some distinctions in the music, music generally, in Scotland and Ireland. And I'm talking by later, I mean like 18th century, 17th, 18th century. Yeah, we're very culturally close.
Very good. Okay, well we can officially end this session and we can give Karen an excellent round of applause. I was going to say a round of applause big enough to echo right across the Atlantic. Thank you very much, Karen.